who I read together with and talk together with and teach together with. Somebody who knows more about certain things. I have forgotten more about comics and pop culture. No, he's forgotten more than I will ever know. How does that metaphor go? Anyway, so here to share with us a little bit about Christianity and comic books, Gary Peterson.
Thank you. Thanks, I appreciate that. And I'm really glad to be here today talking about one of my passions, comic books. Anybody here love comic books? Okay, all right, good. Well, let me open with a quick prayer. We'll just thank God. Father, I just thank you for all of us gathered here to learn how to come to worship you through what these wonderful artists and creators have done through the visual arts. And I just pray it's inspiring and draws us closer to you. And there's also that it lightens the heart before we head off to our next classes. And I just ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm a big comic book fan. I've been reading comics since about 1975. I was about 8 years old, through the mid-'80s. And this really consumed my life. I was one of those geeky kids in school. And I was a Christian since I was 13. And I always was interested in Christian comic books, and that's what today will be about. Comic books made by Christians for Christians, and that, being an old guy, I'm 50, so these date to the 60s, 70s. I think maybe if I bump into the 80s, it's purely by accident. So I'm going to step out of the way so you can see. Maybe I'll step up on the stage. Ooh, the rarefied air up here. Okay, and me and technology don't work so well, so I'm going to try my best here. Oops, I forgot to turn it on. There we go. Okay, it wouldn't be a Peterson class if I didn't have peanuts, so I got it out of the way. It wouldn't be a Linder class without coffee. It wouldn't be a Freeman class without an awesome soapbox, right? So here's our peanuts. This is about comic books, but I want to throw inside about comic strips. Charles Schulz Peanuts, which ended in 2000 before right around the time you guys were born, but he was a Christian. Sad to report, though, that he did drift from his faith at the end of his life, but a lot of his comic strips deal with Christian and Bible issues, and Robert Short put together this great book in 1964, The Gospel According to Peanuts, and if you've seen the Charlie Brown Christmas special, you know it's very gospel-centric. So then there was a Gospel According to Superman that came out in the early 70s. I just throw that in there. People were already, even back then, looking at these pop culture icons and drawing connections to the Christian faith with them. Okay, now we go all the way back. Has anyone heard of William Blake as the artist? You might know his poems. Okay, I see a few hands, erstwhile English majors especially. William Blake was right at the tail end of the 1700s. He was a poet and he was also an artist, and he was an amazing artist. And he's often considered like a forerunner to comic book art, just by the way he drew these figures. This is God creating the universe. The great architect of the universe is, I think, the title of this one. And you can see it's got kind of a comic book look, Here's a picture Blake did of Jacob's Ladder. Again, that color and space and all these kind of comic book themes. I'm going to be going briskly. I expanded this thing. I did this talk in 2010, and I blew the dust off, and then I expanded it. Now it's like bursting at 60 slides, so I have to move at a brisk pace. Here's the Angel of Revelation, which I think would fit on a comic book cover today. I mean, it's got that superhero physique. And then another great artist on the heels of Blake, late Victorian, a French guy, Gustave Doré. I'm sure you've seen his work. It pops up everywhere in biblical stuff. Moses with the Ten Commandments above his head and Jesus praying in the garden. Oh, there's the one I was just talking about. I knew I'd seen it somewhere recently. So again, very comic book-esque in that dynamic way it's, the picture's framed and the light behind it and that. Here's another one. Just an amazing artist. These are mostly steel engravings, and he did 700 and something of them. He did them for the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He did them for Dante's Divine Comedy. He did a ton for the Bible. So here's the Day of Judgment. Again, very super heroic. You could imagine like Angel from the X-Men back there and stuff like that. So now here's early Christian comics. The Catholics got in on the ground floor with this in the 40s with a comic book series called Treasure Chest. It ran 400-something issues for 1972. And I have a bunch of issues of this. You can get them dirt cheap. They have very religious themes. The comic books are filled with all different stuff. They would give them out free in Catholic schools every 2 weeks. I think it was a bi-weekly, but it had puzzles. It had little short things on saints, but it also had profiles of sports stars and things like that. So it wasn't heavily religious. It was something just great for kids. I wish there was something like that today. Coach John Gardner, I don't know what team, but in 1955, I think when that issue came out, he was a named coach. And here's a pre-Vatican II, very Catholic cover, Mary, the Queen of Heaven on that one. Not stuff you see on comic books today, but it still has that look, you know, that just the way the color and the lighting is. And then communism, the Cold War. This is from 1961. The Statue of Liberty, and then the sickle and hammer of communism, which maybe isn't an image that resonates with you. You know, communism fell around 91, so. But it was a big deal then, and often written about, especially of the persecution of religious rights, because that's what communism, one of the first things they did was to close the churches and suppress religion, so. Now, this was an interesting series in this Treasure Chest comic. It was actually drawn by Joe Sinnott, who was also inking the Fantastic Four at the time, and if you follow the Silver Age of Marvel comics, the Fantastic Four was Marvel's flagship book. You wouldn't know it by how the movies, you know, failed compared to the other ones, but the Fantastic Four was the flagship book. Joe Sinnott was the inker over Jack Kirby's pencils, but he was moonlighting, or maybe this was his primary job, but he was drawing the series Pettigrew for President. It ran in 1964, so figure not even a year after the Kennedy assassination. And it was set in 1976, so set 12 years in the future. And the shock was, at the end of this story, Pettigrew turns out to be a black guy. And he looks uncannily like Barack Obama. And I'm surprised this didn't get more press back in 2008 when he ran, but it was very forward-thinking for 1964. Catholic comic book to do this series, and it turned out to be prophetic. DC Comics got in on this in the 70s. You know, they did a big, gigantic treasury. It's one of these oversized comic books all about the Bible. Has a lot of Bible stories in there. This was a fold-out cover, so front and back. Moses is there. The colorist obviously wasn't paying attention. He just colored the whole row blue, including Moses' bare chest. It's really a nice book, though. I have this one, and they do a pretty faithful job of reproducing the Bible stories. So, and then one of the big names in Christian comics, maybe the biggest name in Christian comic books itself, would be Al Hartley. Very little known, but outside of that circle, he worked for Archie Comics, but he also did some work for Marvel. Spire Christian Comics is owned by Spire Books, published by Fleming H. Revell. They put out a whole line of Christian comic books, and there's some of them there on the back. Al Hartley, when he was young, he since passed away, 2003. He did work for Marvel back in the 50s and 60s. Here's a couple covers he did, or a splash page. Patsy Walker, the prettiest gal in town. Definitely not a politically correct comic book today, but in late 50s it worked. And Patsy Walker, this was a comic book made for girls. You know, it's kind of like an Archie type of thing, romance and things like that. But in the 70s, they actually brought Patsy Walker into the Marvel Universe. Does anybody know what character she became? I think she's still around. No, that's DC. This is Marvel, but the Hellcat. I don't know if anyone watches The Defenders. Is the Hellcat in The Defenders? But she was in the 70s and 80s. Okay, I guess not. Anyway, forget that dated reference. Not yet. Well, keep an eye peeled. If you hear the name Patsy Walker, she might show up. And then he did a Giant Man and Wasp thing. His artwork is kind of cartoony. He was really well suited for Archie comics. And he did do these Christian Archie comics. And is anyone even familiar with Archie comics anymore? They're still around, but they're not nearly what they used to be in the 70s. Huh? Oh, they are? Yeah, well, that's the problem. But Archie came out in the 40s, and their comics are very much of their period, but they did have a nice, wholesome appeal. And Betty and Veronica and Reggie and Jughead and all these guys. But these were specifically Christian ones. And here's one of her praying in school. And these teachers are appalled in the third panel. But they had stories like that. Here's one about different worldviews. Reggie is consumed with megalomania. I am the center of the universe. Everything exists for me. I am my own God, as he traipses through a field with his arms outspread. But it did a good job of portraying, this is the humanistic, road to go down. It's the books were very good for comic books. It was a little deeper than what you would expect in a comic book, especially an Archie comic. Al Hartley also did these gritty urban dramas. These are based on real life stories. Dave Wilkerson's Crossing the Switchblade, you might be familiar with that. And the movie with Eric Estrada and Pat Boone, maybe you saw that in the day. Tom Skinner, Up from Harlem, based on a real book. It was it's kind of like the old Warner Brothers cartoons were often done to promote the music of Warner Brothers, music and records. Spire Books would publish these as real books, and then they would do these comic book adaptations. So it was kind of a cross-marketing thing, but it produced some really good stuff. Biographies of famous singers, Andre Crouch and Johnny Cash. Like I said, this is kind of a dated time capsule. Thanks. All right, I'm back on. Thank you, Ben. Okay, taking it up where we were. Wow, this one seems really loud. Christian Classic Stories, updated for today. In His Steps, if you might know, is an 1897 story written by a pastor from Kansas. And here you got it with hippies and toting guitars and backpacks out hitchhiking across the country. And then God Smuggler, you might know that story too, smuggling Bibles into communist Russia. Then he also tackled the end times. Now, this was a big period for premillennial dispensationalism and the end times, what we officially teach. And this was based on a Hal Lindsey book. And Hartley did a really good job adapting it to the comic book form. Exciting explanation of the book of Revelation. For me as a kid, between Chick Tracts and this, that's where I got most of my eschatological training. And some of it the wrinkles got smoothed out as I got to Grace. But there's the chart at the bottom, God's outline of history. You've probably seen that in some form. And, history is moving just as he predicted. And then what happens? The rapture, And I thought he did a great job of picturing that. Bell bottoms and mini skirts. But, if it happened in 1973, this is what it would have looked like. But again, something you usually don't see in comic books. Now here's a comic book cover you just cannot make up. It's like a camp classic. It shows up all over the place. Hansi, the girl who loved the swastika. Definitely not politically correct. The book is I've not actually seen a copy. I only read about it. It's hard to get. It's actually pricey, but it's, I think just because of the cult, strangeness of it. But it's about a girl in Nazi Germany who was diehard Nazi who came to Christ, and she has a ministry. She's still alive. In fact, I just Wikipedia her today. I hate to use that as a noun or verb, but I looked her up, and she's still alive and living in America. And she wrote a book by that name. That's her biography. Has anyone seen Chick Tracts? They're little comic book ones. I'm a big fan of those. Yeah, if you come to my office, I got some. You can come and take a few. Jack Chick, been around forever. He passed away last October, 92 years old. And I actually got a picture of him here because there was no pictures of him floating around except his high school picture. He's kind of like Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man. He doesn't want to be photographed. He's almost like a hermit. And Chick was that way. But since he passed away, they've had a lot of pictures and even some video of him. And he did these things. If you know Jack Chick and his tracks, he's very anti-Catholic, and he did this. This was a book written by Jimmy Akin, who's one of the big shots of Catholic Answers, criticizing Chick tracts. They really did feel the pinch of Chick tracts on influencing Catholics against Catholicism. And these you might have seen around, a couple classics. These Bible stories with a message, that one's about David and Bathsheba. Doomtown's about Sodom and Gomorrah. They do go after Catholics pretty viciously. The death cookie, of course, is the Eucharist, which is very offensive. The consecration prayer is hocus pocus dominocus in there. So, I mean, it's pretty tough. And then these other ones, why is Mary crying? Are Roman Catholics Christians? You can guess what Chick's answer was to that. And he's known for, he had a former Jesuit, the authenticity of which Alberto Rivera has been questioned, but he did a lot to fuel stuff. It does get a little bit out of hand with conspiracy theories. He's done some stuff on Islam. Allah Had No Son is a really good one, I think. And Unforgiven is about the black Muslims, Louis Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam, that Malcolm X was a part of, and Muhammad Ali. And he talks about that in that one. And he's not a fan of Halloween either. We part company there. I'm a fan. But the Devil's Night and Boo, Evolution, he goes after that, and some good tracks. Big Daddy has been around since the 70s. And here's an example of his, you're either in or you're out. So I always think that must be Richard Dawkins in the silhouette there, taking a dive. Now, if you've ever seen Chick tracts, there's two distinct artists. There's the cartoony guy, and there's the guy who does really finely polished art. And the guy who does the finely polished art is this guy. He's a pastor in California, still alive, Fred Carter. This one on the left is from a tract in the 70s called Soul Story, at the height of the blaxploitation movies like Superfly and Shaft. And he drew himself as the main character. He's aged since then, but he's really, really good. And he did the Crusaders comic books, if you've ever seen the Chick comic books. And he does these paintings that are amazing. This one is one of my favorites. You know, it's the angel of light, Lucifer. And until you look close, you don't realize his hands are covered in dripping blood. It's such a beautiful painting, though. But that's exactly how Satan appears as like that. This is an early one from the mid-70s, The Broken Cross. It's about Satanism and a cult. This whole town is a coven of witches. If you watch any of those old 70s movies, Devil's Reign, Run with the Devil, this is right in that thing. Chick did have his hand on the pulse of what was popular at the time. Like, he's done tracks on Harry Potter and other current things, Dungeons and Dragons, when I was younger. So this was a really good one, too. That Broken Cross comic actually has a scene in there of like this guy who's gnawing on human fingers. And the Comics Journal, which is a secular magazine about comics, did an article on the Crusaders comics, and they said, wow, these are really edgy. They have stuff in there that they couldn't even do in mainstream comics. Like, for a while there, Marvel couldn't even call zombies zombies. They had to rename them Zuvembis because of some comics code rule that was too scary or something. But here you got a guy who's gnawing on fingers. Now, the criticism of these comics is that they kind of break the rule of comics, which are supposed to be dynamic and action-packed and fun, and they really do often degenerate into just being talking heads, page after page of talking heads, very text-heavy like that and like this. And, they're very filled with faith and Bible verses, but they do tend to be, they go against the medium of dynamism. Here's another one. If you're going to steal from the best. I love Fred Carter, but he did swipe this cover right from Gustave Doré. You notice the people climbing up the mountain. You can see the arc way in the background under the lightning bolt. And it looks suspiciously like this picture from Gustave Doré with the people climbing up the mountain and the arc in the background in silhouette. But I always say, if you're going to steal from the best, and he did, they're both really powerful paintings. Doré did a really nice job with the arc stuff because he really kind of showed what happened after. Like, we always think of the arc. We forget about all the people who are after. And in this one, I always like to show this little, there's a baby at the bottom of the picture. There's a parent, it looks like, holding up their baby above the water, but it's in vain, the water will soon overtake him, so. And here's another artist, Basil Wolverton. He worked for Mad Magazine. He's also a Christian. He fell in with the Worldwide Church of God, Herbert W. Armstrong, and did some stuff in the 70s for DC and some sci-fi in the 50s. He had a real distinct style, and there's a book out collected all of his work. The Worldwide Church of God was publishing these books of Bible stories in the 50s and 60s, and he did the illustrations, and these are just a few of them here. The creation of Adam, the expulsion from the garden, and then this one, Outside the Ark 2. I always like the Noah's Ark stuff, but it's the people drowning, scratching, trying to get in. It's too late. And then the apocalypse. Now, you might have seen this picture, because this one, it seems like it pops up in different places. And of course, in the 50s, when they thought of the end of the world, they immediately thought in terms of the atomic bomb. I don't think your generation thinks that way, but that's how I was raised too. It's going to be, mutual nuclear annihilation between us and the Soviet Union. Now, Basil Wolverton, because he was such an interesting character, he added these radiation mutants in the post-bomb day, and he did a great job with them. I'm surprised they got published in the Christian book, And then the last guy we'll look at is Crumb, Robert Crumb, underground cartoonist, big hippie kind of a guy. He did this iconic image in the 60s, Keep on Truckin'. He did the cover for Janis Joplin's album here, Cheap Thrills. That kind of put him on a little bit of a mainstream map. And then in 2009, he did a lot of other stuff too. Felix the Cat, they made that into a movie, or Fritz the Cat in the 70s. But the book of Genesis, he did this in 2009. He's living in France in exile now, self-imposed. But he got interested in the Bible, so he does a verse-by-verse, complete telling of the Bible story. Again, another guy who stole from Doré. There's Doré's on the left, and then Crumb's on the right. Whenever people draw the ark, it seems they always default to Doré. He just had it just right. It's kind of bulging. It's got that keel down the middle. It may not be the authentic way, but it works for art, especially from that angle. But that's the story, and it is word for word. Everything from Genesis is in there. And here's a picture of his drawing style, which I really like. And that movie, they did a documentary on him back in '95. It's very good, too. Not Grace approved at last, so don't watch it. I'm glad I snuck that in there. But one thing I like about what he did is that for all the tables of nations, the Toledoth, or whatever you want to use the fancy terms, the genealogies, where there's just these lists of names, he would actually draw, and for real people, all these different faces. So you get these are the sons of Ishmael. And I wouldn't know any of them either. But after reading it like this, you kind of connect it to a face. Of course, they don't look at, we have no way of knowing. But it just makes you wonder, where did these people live? And, he did use real people for models. Hey, well, that's it. I think I even got done a little bit early. I was going at such a breakneck pace. Any questions while there's just a second left before we dismiss? Well, I guess I should wait see if any hands go up. Race to the answer. Dr. Lundgren, when I was in teacher ed, accused me of doing that, and nothing's changed after all these years. So, well, I hope you enjoyed that, and it's a great medium, comics. I'm sure there's new Christian comics that are being published. I just don't know what they are. Okay. One dissatisfied customer, I apologize. I should have got some Paw Patrol or something in here, more that age. Okay, well, thanks, and blessings, and have a great, wonderful rest of the day. I'll take the liberty of dismissing us. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.